Hi there and welcome. Jonathan here. These talks are offered freely so that no one is ever denied access to these practices. Your support makes a big difference. If you feel inspired to make a donation, please go to jonathanfoust.com. Thank you. With this topic of transforming relationship to addiction, I was emailed by Jill asking if I might talk a little bit about video games, which of course can be a real challenge for some people. It reminded me of this little story that I was speaking with a young man about video games and about his addiction. We were talking about it. And he said, well, were you ever addicted to a game? And I said, well, I was addicted to the hokey pokey, but I turned myself around. Couldn't resist, sorry. I cracked myself up with that one. But of course the topic is not so funny. How many of us know of someone who has struggled with addiction of some kind? Yeah. Pretty much every one of us here. 23 million people aged 12 and over suffer from alcohol and drug addiction in our culture. 15 million on alcohol, 4 million on drugs, and the rest on both. And I just saw, maybe you saw this headline in the Washington Post this morning. There were 174 heroin overdoses in 6 days in Cincinnati. They think that the batch was laced with carfentanil, which is the strongest opioid that's made commercially. It's designed to create a stronger, longer lasting high, but something was in the mix, but 174 people. So there is the abuse of drugs and substances, but of course it goes so much beyond that, to social media, to video games, to food, and on and on and on. I was never really exposed to addiction until college. I was renting a house with a bunch of other people, and one of my housemates had a friend who was just passing through town, a friend of his from high school. And I went to college in Wisconsin, which is the manufacturer of great cheap beer. And you could buy a case of Huber beer for $2.89. It's crazy. So I had bought a case. It was cheaper than milk. So I had bought a case of beer, and I went out that night. And when I came back, his friend was passed out in a chair with 24 bottles of beer around him. I had never seen anything like that, and it shocked me and it scared me because I just didn't know what to do. It was so clearly a really big issue, and it gave me a little glimpse into the helplessness that can come with addiction. I am not at all an expert on the topic, but I have the deepest respect for those who have worked through these issues. It's wrenching and it's also liberating. There's no question about it. And addiction is not just limited to substances. It runs from the gross to the subtle. You may recall how when we've explored the forgiveness practices, where you forgive yourself, you forgive And you ask forgiveness for yourself. And for many of us, it's like, well, I didn't do anything wrong. But you ask for forgiveness for your actions that were perhaps not pure, your thoughts and your speech. So we actually can get very addicted to the way we speak, but particularly the way we think. And that can be a very helpful place to pay attention, the reflex of the habitual thinking, speech, and action that you move into when things aren't going well in your life. So what I'd like to talk about tonight is first about how addiction is all about pain. And it's all about seeing clearly, seeing what's true. And how addiction is also all about identifying the unmet need. Something you're needing that's not happening, that triggers certain behaviors. And then it's about a strategy for how to work with your triggers and how to access compassion and the whole process of letting go. So from everything I understand, it's about pain and suffering that kicks everything off. A very smart CEO and a board member who was on a board of an organization that I was part of told me how he went off to have his knees replaced. And he was able to self-dose his medication when he needed it. And he didn't realize how dependent he had become on being able to just make the pain go away. And he was a really tough guy. He was like one of the toughest people I've ever run across. And the way he described having to go through that process, I could see in his eyes how deeply humbling it was. We feel pain and we want release. It's as simple as that. For many years, I would lead retreats where we would do fasting. And they're really wonderful retreats. We would do, meditation and all kinds of processes, but also we would, go through a whole fasting process. Very purifying. And I realized after a while that the same people were coming back again and again. And this was many, many years ago, before there's a whole lot of literature and study of eating disorders. But it was very clear that for many people, this was very much tied into their patterns around food. And I remember reading a book called Feeding the Hungry Heart. And with the one line of the book that really triggered me was when someone said, "And now I've come to realize when I open the refrigerator door, what I'm really needing is a hug." That was pivotal for me. So the pain is physical, the pain is emotional. And it all becomes how we relate to it. And as I've been reflecting on this topic, I grew up on a farm and with a really strong work ethic. And I worked through high school, I worked through college, I worked through grad school. And I realized at one point that my work was not that healthy. I was averaging maybe 70 hours a week for many, 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 many years. I remember going to talk to one of my managers about it, who very quickly identified himself as a workaholic and how much he loved surrounding himself with other workaholics because he loved getting so much done. He wasn't any help. So I began to realize when I looked at what work was for me, that staying busy and having a to-do list that was way beyond what I could ever get to, even though it made me anxious, the work was a way of soothing myself. Just staying busy It soothed me, and what it helped me to avoid was a very deep feeling of loneliness that I had, a very deep sense of questioning my own self-worth. So the only way I could, in that frame, achieve value was by being highly productive and getting praise for it. So much of life and this practice of meditation is noticing what's happening and then noticing how you're relating to it, noticing the attitude in your mind. That's very much key. So if you think about the last time that you felt disappointment, or you were wanting something to be different, or you were complaining, or you felt hurt, it's helpful to just notice how you reacted to it. What was your pattern of reactivity? That's a little bit of what I'd like to talk about tonight. So something happens when you react. And if you don't have awareness, your entire life is reactivity. You're just reacting. What the practice is designed to do is to open up this space between stimulus and response. So instead of something happening and immediately reacting, there's a little gap of awareness. And as someone said, that gap between stimulus and response is the difference between reacting how you've always reacted and opening up to a whole new set of possibilities. So much of the studies done on mindfulness and addiction are really demonstrating that when you do this practice, you become more aware. You start to become more aware of what's happening and all the patterns you have of relating to it. Not that it's easy and not that it's fun, but you start to see reality. So it's so much about waking up out of the trance of your reactive patterns. And really about liberation, about becoming more free. And so we engage into this practice of paying attention on purpose. There's a quote I ran across that said that meditation drives at the root of compulsive behaviors by undermining the assumption that inner experience is intolerable and requires immediate relief. Again, whenever we feel discomfort, the habitual way is to nuke it, make it go away as quickly as possible. What the practice can do is actually make it possible for you to look a little bit closer at that discomfort and perhaps find a new way of being with it. So we're designed to kind of run away from our pain. We do it through self-soothing, we do it through lots of different ways. And mindfulness gives you the capacity to turn toward it. So this is kind of a long story. I'm going to try and make it really short. I lived in an ashram for 20-some years, and I had an arranged marriage, as did other people in the community. It's hard to imagine as I look back on it. A really wonderful person who, a really, really great person, but not someone that I felt I wanted to spend my life with. And yet I had made a commitment, and at one point I found myself self-medicating. I remember I remember exactly where I was, and I was sort of having my third beer, and I'm a lightweight around alcohol. I really don't like it. And I just, as I was drinking this beer, I just thought, what is going on? And there was something about just the sincere sense of like, what are you doing? What is going on? And this little voice, and it was really, I experienced it as a little voice that said, your marriage is over. And there was something about that realization that helped me to make a shift. Because I saw clearly that I was trying to make something work that really wasn't working. And it did take a while, but I wanted to really take the high road as to how to exit out of that relationship. Suffering is all about your relationship to change. The formula, which I know many of you have heard before, is P times R equals S. Pain times resistance equals suffering. When you're in pain and you resist it, you will suffer. And you can be in pain and not resist it and not necessarily suffer. It doesn't mean you're not in pain. It just means you're not adding anything to it. So the challenge is, when you feel pain, to actually pause and investigate it. So just a short little Zen pop quiz reflection. If you like, you can close your eyes. And you might just bring into mind a time, maybe today or in the last few days, where you experienced some form of disappointment or hurt, or you had some complaint. You might take a moment just to kind of go through the files. And as you reflect on the event, can you identify the emotions that you felt? What are the emotions that you felt in response to that? It's usually not just one. And then if you like, you can deepen the breath and let your eyes open. And this practice of seeing clearly, or vipassana, is a real determination to see what's true. And I've mentioned this before, but I always find it helpful, that there's sort of this chain of causality that occurs. You experience something energetically. It's just sort of it's a feeling. And from that feeling, you have a thought. If you think the same thought over and over and over again, that thought calcifies into a belief. If you believe something, it becomes a habit. The habit forms your character, and your character becomes your destiny. So when you look closely at yourself, it's very helpful to really sense what arises out of your life experience. When you experience discomfort or unpleasant, you react energetically. You have thoughts, you have beliefs, you have certain habits out of reactivity, and they form your character and they form your destiny. And so you also get to see your patterns. When things aren't going your way, some of us move into anger, judgment, blame, ill will. Some of us disassociate and go off into planning and fantasy. Some of us get stimulated into a never-ending cycle of anxiety and worry and restlessness. Some of us just disengage, just pull the plug and move into sloth and torpor, depression. And some of us get stimulated by severe doubt and severe self-criticism. It's helpful to recognize those 5 ways of reacting. But then it's also helpful to recognize what are the triggers that send you off. And each one of us has our own unique sense of what triggers us. And then how do you self-soothe? How do you take care of yourself? What are the activities you do that help you to find a sense of peace? And are they ultimately gratifying? So seeing all these reactive patterns, and for many of us, once we begin to recognize them, we begin to see they're somewhat predictable. Then the question becomes, how do you cultivate a shift in relationship to those? And it's important to point out, particularly when we look through this lens of non-judging awareness or mindfulness, that there's something beyond energy, feeling, thought, belief, habit, character, and destiny. And you can call that awareness. You can call that wakefulness, or you could even call it your true nature is aware of all of these patterns and how they all play out. They're accessible to you when you can quiet the mind. So when we look at how our reactive, habitual, or addictive patterns, how they arise in relationship to pain and suffering, it's very important to recognize that the very heart of that is identifying the unmet need. My own experience of how much of my life I was missing because I was caught in endless work. It pointed to an unmet need for intimacy, like to know that I was actually okay without having to prove myself all the time. My realization about my marriage being over was pointing to an unmet need to take action and find some support as to how I might do that as skillfully as possible. This awareness of the unmet need can be so helpful. And why don't we do another brief little reflection here? And again, you can let your eyes close, and as we've been exploring sort of stimulus and response, you might again just think of a time when you felt some challenge or difficulty or disappointment or anger. Maybe reflecting on these 5 mind states you may have experienced, perhaps recently: aversion, anger, judgment, blame. Maybe finding yourself lost in fantasy or planning. Maybe caught in endless worry. Or just losing energy, vitality, feeling depression. Or maybe doubt or self-judgment. As you reflect on this, you might take a moment just to sense, when you feel this discomfort, what does it feel like on the inside? Can you locate that? And can you sense here, what is the unmet need? What are you wanting? What are you hoping for that hasn't happened yet? And you might inquire, if that need was met, what would that feel like? And what would that be like inside? And as you're ready, you can deepen the breath. And if you like, you can let the eyes open. I had a lot of really naive concepts around addiction. That it was bad, that people who were addicted were weak in some way. And it kind of got reinforced by the stories in my family. My grandfather smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day and then had a heart attack, and his doctor told him he had to stop smoking, and he just quit like the next day. So there's always that sense of, well, that's how a real man does it. And as I became a little more worldly and began to really interact with those who have struggled with addiction, I've noticed one thing in common, and that is a very, very deep sensitivity. And those who actively work with addiction, again, I have the deepest respect for the humility that is required to see clearly. And the recognition that we all have needs, and we all have unmet needs. Everyone here at some point has been betrayed. And the recognition that suffering is part of life. That there's a cause for that suffering, which lies at its root some form of identification or clinging or holding on. The recognition that we can let go, and that there are skillful means to support us in that. So the fundamental inquiries of the practice: what is happening right now? What is the stimulus right now? And can I be with it? Can I let it be? The process of letting go requires 2 elements. One is wisdom, to see what's true. When you recognize a habit or a pattern that you recognize as unskillful, as unwholesome, as unhealthy, seeing that, very, very helpful, whether it be an addiction to substance or just recognizing that you have a habitual way of moving into judgment, of blame, something unskillful. The second element is equally as important and maybe even more challenging, and that is opening the door of compassion, opening the door of empathy, of kindness, because that is the lubrication that allows you to let go. There was someone who had told me how he was utterly miserable and felt deeply caught in his patterns and his habits. And he went out for a walk at night, and then suddenly he just stopped and he said out loud, "I need help. I can't do this by myself." His whole life was patterned around not needing help, about being self-contained. And we all have that element of feeling like we can do it by ourselves. But opening that door to compassion, kindness, and empathy is truly the step that allows us to begin to feel the pain fully and to begin to hold it in loving presence. And this is what leads to compassion. Just as in those who are actively in recovery, one of the most powerful things is to hear other people's stories and to share your story. And what that is like a direct path to tongue gland meditation. And I think of the essence of tongue gland meditation as other people feel this too. You recognize in your suffering that you are not alone. And it's truly through the Sangha, through our collective, through your friendships, through those you know, through communication, that you begin to recognize that your struggles are shared among others. To see self in other and other in self is where our healing really begins. It's interesting when you look at the research being done on mindfulness and recovery. It really speaks to these elements. The first is to see clearly, to honestly look at your life and to look at the triggers in your life, to identify what's between you and feeling free or feeling happy, to see your reactive patterns, to identify those clearly. The second is to, again, honestly evaluate and own up to the unmet need. That wherever there is some form of pain, there is some unmet need. And when you can identify the unmet need, it can begin to change how you react to pain and discomfort. The third element is learning how to meet your experience with compassion. Learning strategies for how to access more expansive states. Learning how to, and it's a challenge for each one of us in our own way, how to tap into the expansive states of gratitude, of appreciation, and through that into empathy, compassion, and kindness. And the fourth element, of course, is looking at supportive systems. Oftentimes there's kind of a change in lifestyle. It's a real honest assessment of what in your life is draining you, what in your life is no longer serving you, and what in your life is feeding you, giving you energy and lighting you up. And again, being very, very honest in that assessment and looking at how you can change the externals to support the internals. So there's some good news in this, as much as there is such a wave of addiction in our culture, that there are over, this kind of blew me away. There are 700,000 people every day seeking treatment. That's kind of cool. When you think of 700,000 people in this country who are saying at some point, this is no longer working, I need help. There are more than 25,000 Narcotics Anonymous groups in the world. And there's a tremendous amount of research and much more understanding, and I think, and much more compassion about recognizing that whatever our forms of addiction are, whether they be gross or whether they be as subtle as the habitual patterns I move into around judgment, blame, aversion. The good news is that we can free ourselves by seeing it clearly. So why don't we do a short meditation with a little reading. You might feel the breath, and in your own way, let yourself just sort of sense and feel kind of this two-part definition of awareness. And noticing what is happening as it's happening. And noticing how you're holding what's happening. You might bring into mind if there are those that you know who are struggling. Perhaps to include yourself if you are struggling. And in this recognition that suffering is part of our human experience. That for each of us, we each have a capacity for something to arise out of our suffering. The capacity to see clearly, the capacity to open into compassion. Just reflecting on these following words. There is a brokenness out of which comes the unbroken, a shatteredness out of which blooms the unshatterable. There is a sorrow beyond all grief which leads to joy, and a fragility out of whose depths emerges strength. There is a hollow space too vast for words, through which we pass with each loss, out of whose darkness we are sanctioned into being. There is a cry deeper than all sound, whose serrated edges cut the heart as we break open to the place inside which is unbreakable and whole, while learning to sing. And deepening the breath. And when you're ready, you can let your eyes open.